I'm going to be talking about some fallacies in economic reasoning. I'll be putting in, kind of extending it a bit also, some of the fallacies will be in libertarian political philosophy. I hope this is all right. I figure I can do this since this is my lecture. I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to be talking about fallacies in reasoning. Bertrand Russell once said there are two kinds of reasoning, deductive and bad. Now, excuse me. Well, they've wired me up. I don't know. It is on. Yeah, I guess if you can't hear me, you're probably better off anyway. Yes, better to be uncomfortable and hear me than be comfortable and not hear me. I would have had the other reverse preference, but I suppose these things are subjective. All right, so as I say, it's very easy to make mistakes in reasoning. I just want to give one example of this. We'll see how you do on this. Unfortunately, I very often make a mistake myself when I'm setting this up, so we'll see what happens. I want to give an example here where we imagine there are 4 cards. Each card has on one side a letter and on the other side a number. So let me do this. Supposing we have... Wait, this isn't drawing too well. What's happening here? Let's try this one. That's better. So suppose we have the first one has a letter on it. I will put the first one here. Has a letter A. So there's a number on the other side of this. Then the next one here, let's see, number 2, has a number on it. So there'll be a letter on the other side. And then let's say the third one has a letter on it. There'll be a number on the other side. And the last one has a number on it. So there'll be a letter on the other side. So now, let's suppose we want to find out whether this statement is true. If there is a vowel on one side of the card, there will be an even number on the other. If there's a vowel on one side, there will be an even number on the other. Now, suppose I want to find out, is that statement true? Well, one way I could find out is to turn over all the cards and see whether it's true. But the question I want to ask is, can I find out whether this statement is true by just turning over some lesser number, not all of the cards, but some lesser number? Which cards would I have to turn over to find out where that statement, if there's a vowel on one side of the card, there's an even number on the other? Which ones would I have to turn over to find out if it's true? Yes. The first and the fifth. Yeah, A and 5. Yeah. Yes. And does anyone else have any different answers? Yes. A and 2. Yeah. So we have 2 answers. Anyone else? Just A. So we have just A. Actually, the first answer is the correct one, because you see, the only way this statement it could be false if there's a vowel on one side and an odd number on the other. So in this one, you need to check it, because it says you need to find out. It says there's an even number, so you need to find out is there is a vowel, so you need to find out is there an even number on the other side. This one, it doesn't matter what's on the other side. suppose there's a consonant on the other side. Doesn't matter, that doesn't contradict the statement. Similarly, doesn't matter what's on this side. On the other side of this is a consonant. Doesn't matter what's on that side. This one is an even number, so you have to check to see whether there's a vowel on the other side. So see, this is, as you see, sometimes these things reasoning can be very tricky. And in fact, in tests that have been done by psychologists who investigate this sort of thing, I think Daniel Kahneman was one of the, most people miss this example. Now, I put this on not just to show that reasoning is sometimes difficult, but this will come up, this very example will come up later in the lecture if I remember that part of the lecture. All right. So what I want to give is the first example, the first type of cases of mistakes in reasoning are outright logical errors. Not everything I'll be discussing an outright mistake. But the first one I want to talk about is a mistake in reasoning. And this is an argument you find given by a quite influential economist, Robert Frank, who is he's a very good popular writer in addition to his reputation as a technical economist. And his books almost always, or I should say always, have some criticism of the free market in them. And he uses an argument, which I'll give an example of, and just so you get what it's like. He gives the example of athletes, baseball players, football players, who take steroids. Now, why does an athlete take steroids? That this is so they'll improve their performance. I'm not really, don't know how the steroids work. As you can see, I don't take them myself. But as I understand it, they build up your muscle mass, and so you find that's why we have 500-pound football players or other things like that. But they have various bad side effects, like they apparently make you more susceptible to cancer and heart disease, and they can induce certain types of anger spells, uncontrollable anger spells. Apparently, just judging by what one reads in the newspapers, one of the bad effects of steroids is that it makes people lie about whether they take steroids when they're giving testimony. All right, so Robert Frank gives this argument. He says, well, why would an athlete take steroids? It's so he'll have an advantage over his competitors, but that depends on the other people not taking steroids. So, but once people know about steroids, they'll all start taking them. So then there's no gain to anyone in taking the steroids. And the athletes themselves would recognize that they'd all be better off if no one takes steroids. So you're taking the steroid just because you want to get the sort of the jump, as it were, on the competition, but everybody else is going to be doing it also. So therefore, wouldn't it be best then if there was a ban on steroids? It'd be very difficult for the athletes themselves to agree on this, so the government should impose a ban. Now, you might think, well, steroids is just affects only a comparatively few people, but Frank extends this sort of argument. He said, well, if you look at the way the size of houses has increased in the past 30 or so years, it's a tremendous increase in houses, in size of people's houses. And he said, well, people really don't want larger houses just because they like more space. It's that they want to have a bigger house than their neighbors. So they'll build a bigger house just to try to get more than their neighbors, but then the neighbors are going to try to keep up with them, so they won't gain anything. There'll be no net welfare gains from the extension of the houses beyond a certain point. So the government should impose a very heavy consumption tax to make it more difficult for people to do this. But if they do this, there won't be any welfare loss from doing this, because people don't really want these very large houses anyway. Now, one could, in that last case, question one of the factual premises. Is it the case that people want the larger houses only because they want to have bigger houses than their neighbors? And we could ask how Frank knows that. He doesn't seem to give in his books much evidence for that. But I want to raise a different problem for this sort of argument, kind of one dealing purely with the logic of the argument. Now, let's take the steroid case, because I think it's easier to see what the problem is. He's made a jump here from the true statement. You take steroids in order to get an advantage over your competitors. He's jumped from that to the premise, you gain an advantage over your competitors only if they don't take steroids. He's assuming that if you take steroids and everyone else does, then the competitive order of the players will remain the same. Let's suppose there's a group of 10 athletes, and say the one who ranked as the third best decided he'd like to move up to number 1, so he takes steroids, but everybody else takes steroids, so Frank is assuming, well, then he remains at number 3, and I guess he didn't try hard enough, so there's no point to his taking steroids if everyone else does. But that doesn't follow at all, you can see, because that assumes that the steroids have the same effect on everyone. What if you gain from it even if everybody else does? Maybe the steroids make you more muscular than they do other people, or so he's falsely assumed, which he needs to show, that for his argument to work in this kind of case, that taking the steroids, or in general embarking on whatever the process is that leads to this competitive race, will leave everybody else in the same competitive position they were to begin with, and that doesn't follow at all. So this is an example where there's sort of a big logical mistake in the argument. Now, the next class of cases involves one aspect of economics that I talked about in the first lecture I gave. I'm assuming that you didn't come to that lecture since you're here for this one. So I mentioned in that lecture that a lot of people, remember, one of the points that Mises makes in talking about in the first part of Human Action is that the future is uncertain. And I claim that a lot of people read more into that than they should. They think certain radical subjectivists think the future is uncertain, since we can't know anything at all practically nothing at all about the future. And they give, in support of a view sort of that we really don't know much, if anything, about the future, they give certain arguments that, in my view, aren't very good ones. I'd like to mention a couple of these. One is, people will say, Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science that Hans Hoppe discussed not altogether enthusiastically in his first lecture, has this argument. He said, we can't know future knowledge because if we did know it, then obviously we know it now, so it wouldn't be future knowledge. So the very notion of knowing what people will know in the future is logically incoherent, because we know what we know now isn't future knowledge. Now you see what's gone wrong here, that what the conclusion of the argument is true enough if you define future knowledge, as he's apparently done, as knowledge that people will have in future but we don't have now, then it's obviously true that we can't know that knowledge, namely the knowledge they will have in future we don't have now, but we can't know that now because that it contradicts the very definition we've given of future knowledge. But it doesn't follow at all that there is going to be any knowledge of that kind. We might be able, I don't say that we will be able to, it's conceivable, isn't it, that we correctly predict everything that people will discover. And if we do that, then they just won't be getting any future knowledge in the way this argument is defining it. Perhaps this example will make the point clearer. Suppose I think of a number between 1 and 100 and I say, you won't be able to tell what number I'm thinking of. Now, probably you wouldn't be able to do it because, after all, you'd just be guessing. But I mean, supposing someone claimed, well, there were certain psychological laws that enabled you to predict what number I would pick based on certain information you had about me. It wouldn't be a good refutation of your claim to say, well, this prediction, what you're saying couldn't be right, because then it wouldn't be the case that the number I thought of was the number that only I know. Because if you knew it, it wouldn't be the number that only I know. Well, that's true enough, but just what's at issue would be, is it only I who knows the number? So similarly, one can't just, by definition, make it the case that you can't know what people are the knowledge that people will have in the future. I think one problem here that this argument illustrates, where you have to be very careful to avoid fallacy, is the conclusion that the argument that is really aiming for, even though it's defined it in a question-begging way, is probably correct. Probably people will come up with all sorts of knowledge that we won't predict. But you have to be very careful. I mean, after all, people are always coming up with new ideas and inventions. But you have to be very careful when a conclusion seems correct that not to come up with a bad argument for it. In this case, that is, if I'm right, that isn't a very good argument. I want to mention, while we're on the subject of the future, another argument that's sometimes given that questions our future knowledge. This argument is that supposing I predicted that you would do something or wouldn't do something, and I told you the prediction, then you could just do the opposite of what I predicted and undo my prediction. So I couldn't both predict what you were going to do and tell you about this prediction. I'm sure you've heard, probably many of you have heard this argument before, but this argument commits a fallacy of just assuming what it's supposed to be proving, because if the prediction's correct, then if even if I tell you what the prediction is, you're not going to do it. I mean, it's logically possible, I suppose, that you could do the opposite of what I predicted just to show I'm wrong, but if I'm right, you're not going to. That's what's involved in making a correct prediction, after all. I mean, supposing I said, when you go home from this conference, you're not going to murder your entire family. That's my prediction. You're not going to go ahead and do it just to say, oh, I can show he made a mistake in this argument. It's just you see this argument quite often. It's just a very bad argument. Now, I mentioned cases where people just assume what they're supposed to be proving. I want to give another case of that, one that's was quite popular a few years ago, the famous Laffer Curve. I must warn you, I'm very bad at drawing things. So. Okay, now the Laffer Curve. Oh, sorry, I did this. I knew I'd do something wrong here. So this is, yes, that's right. It's too confusing. Yes, that's right. Well, I had a 50-50 chance of getting Okay, now what Laffer quite correctly pointed out was, supposing the government we have a zero rate of taxation, then obviously the government won't be taking in any money. And now supposing, on the contrary, we had 100% taxes, then also the government wouldn't take anything, because why would you work if everything you're going to do is taken over by the government? So we know that at either 100% or 0%, the government will get no revenue. So Laffer concludes from that as you increase taxes, the government from zero, then the government will start to take in revenue. But as you keep raising the marginal tax rate, you'll eventually reach a point, sort of the maximum point. At this rate, the government will take in the most money, but after that point, then the revenue will start to fall, because even though the government will be having higher rates of taxation, people will be reluctant to work, so they'll cut back and the government will take in less money. Now, what's wrong with the notion of the Laffer curve is that he has no argument at all for saying that there is a curve at all. The usual way when he gave this argument, he was using this for the very commendable purpose of arguing that government should reduce marginal tax rates. And he said, if government does this, it'll take in more revenue because it's on the government. We're on this side of the curve, so if the government reduces taxes, it'll move us back in this direction. Then the critics of the Laffer curve said, no, we're actually on this side. So if you reduce rates, the government revenue is going to fall. But they didn't neither side give any justification for thinking there's a curve at all, just from the fact that you know that there are these two 0 points. You don't have any argument for the view that there's kind of this relationship that is sort of moving up to a point, sort of in a smooth way to a maximum point and then moving down. You could find that as you change the rate of taxation, there's no relationship at all. You could just have some sort of very funny kind of thing, that wouldn't be a curve at all. So he's given no argument for the conclusion there. He's just drawn a curve the way he wants to illustrate his claim, but he hasn't given any reason for thinking that that the curve is really, that there is a curve of the way he's postulating. I should say, it is very true, and I think he made a real contribution in stressing that at very high tax rates, the government can get more money by reducing the marginal rate. And there are good empirical studies that show this, but the point I would making here is not that he's wrong to say that, but just that he's given no argument. There's a curve of this kind. He's just drawn something to illustrate what he wants, but hasn't proven it. I remember once at a conference there was a quite I attended, it was in 1986, I think. There was a quite well-known philosopher and political sociologist, Jan Elster, who made a similar fallacy. He made there some sort of claim. He just drew a curve to illustrate his claim, but he had no argument the curve should be drawn that way. So I had to give some comments. So I really tried to hammer him on this point, because he said in discussion, he said the really awful claim that I laugh at my own jokes. So I had to try to let him have it for that. Of course, what he said was it was perfectly true, but he shouldn't have said it. Now I want to give one other error in sort of a mistaken philosophical argument. This one, again, involves a straightforward error in reasoning. This is one that you find in libertarian political theory. There are some people who've argued against the libertarian anarchism in this way. They say, well, if you have a dispute, say a dispute between two libertarian protection agencies, you have to have some agency or some person who will settle the dispute. So whenever you have a dispute, you have to have someone to settle that dispute. But then, doesn't there have to be some final agency that settles all disputes? So that would constitute a government, because it would have the final say in dispute. So it's saying, well, whenever you have a dispute, you have to have some agency to settle it. So therefore, we need to have some central agency to be the final authority on all disputes. Now, regardless of where you stand on the anarchism-minarchism controversy, this argument just is not right. It commits a straightforward logical fallacy. And we can see this if we write down the premise. This time I don't have to worry about drawing a diagram, so if I make a mistake, it won't be that mistake. Okay, so we start off with, let's do this, for every dispute, there must be an agency to settle that dispute. So it's concluded from this, there must be an agency. I just got that first time. Now, can you see why this doesn't follow the conclusion? There must be an agency to settle every dispute. Doesn't follow from the premise. Does anybody like to say what's wrong with the conclusion? Yeah. Oh yes, that's right. Did you want to say something? I don't think so. I mean, I'd be interested if they were. I mean, I don't think it's the same mistake, but I don't think that fallacy was involved in the first. I have to think. I don't see. Yes, in the. Oh, yes, that was exactly the illustration I'm going to give. So you've stolen my next line, but that's all right. So you see, what this is. You were quite correct. I think you got the right answer to the other question. Also, you must be pretty good. All right. So the problem is the first one is sort of what's called a quantifier shift fallacy. This says for every dispute there exists some agency to settle that dispute, and then you shifted the quantifier outside. You said then there must be an agency to settle every dispute. It doesn't have to be the same one. As the gentleman in the back suggested, I was actually going to use this illustration. Suppose we say, sometimes when you're trying to see if an argument is right, it's a good idea to try to come up with an analogy where you're able to see more easily whether the argument works. Suppose you say everyone has a father, which means for every person that person has a father. It doesn't follow that someone is everyone's father. You would have to be pretty busy to do that. But you have to be very careful. This is kind of shift. I remember my great friend Jim Sadowski has one illustration where he says there's sometimes you'll see in the newspaper something like every 37 seconds a woman has another baby. And he says, well, I think we should find out who she is and stop her. Now I want to mention now, these are some fallacies that are straightforward errors. I want to mention another type of mistaken reasoning that isn't a logical error. It's just a mistake, though. And this is the famous broken window fallacy. You've probably heard of that, discussed by Friedrich Bastiat in his great essay, What is Seen and Not Seen, and also by Henry Hazlitt in Economics in One Lesson. I think everyone should read both of those. It's really essential. These are really essential. So what the famous illustration is, a boy throws a brick through someone's window. So then people are saying, well, isn't this awful? He did that. He's a troublemaker. But then someone said, no, he isn't, because the glass maker will have to spend money to repair the glass, and when he does that, the people who supply him with the new glass will take that money and spend it on other things. And so by the fact that the boy has broken the window, he's really a public benefactor because he's generated all this extra spending that'll promote prosperity. And of course, what's wrong with this argument is it doesn't take account of what would have happened had the boy not broken the window, because then it's true that the person with the broken window wouldn't have spent money on getting a new window, but he would have spent the money on other things, and the people he gave that money to would have in turn spent the money. So he wouldn't be, the boy isn't causing some revenue stream to come into existence that wasn't there previously. He's just diverted the spending or changed the spending from what it was, and additionally he's destroyed property, so he isn't a public benefactor at all. Now you might think, well, this fallacy is really too trivial to mention. Surely nobody now would make such a crude mistake. But in fact, Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel Prize winner, committed exactly this fallacy, because he had, after the 9/11 attack, he published a column where he said, well, look, at least however destructive this has been, however terrible the attack, at least this is good for the economy because people have to spend money to repair the buildings and the damage caused by 9/11. So even a Nobel Prize winner can commit a real basic fallacy, especially if he's a left-wing Keynesian. Now, in the time that's left, I want to turn to fallacies in the use of ethics in economics. And here I want to mention, you remember at the beginning of the talk when I put that problem with the cards on the board, I said this will come up later in the lecture. Well, you'll be happy to know we've reached that point. I'm sure you were all anxiously waiting for this point. Well, we're here. Now, the people who, some of the people who have used this and other examples of errors in reasoning, people I have in mind are so-called behavioral economists like Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein in the book they had called Nudge that I reviewed. They've used examples of this kind to support intervention by the state. And what they say is, well, since people commit mistakes in reasoning, then isn't the state justified in some sort of paternalistic action to counteract these mistakes? The idea that behind this is something like this. They call this Libertarian Paternalism. It sounds like a contradiction to me, but what they have in mind is what we really want. We have certain preferences. So if you tell people they shouldn't, try to prevent people from realizing their preferences, then you're interfering with them in an unacceptable way. But people really don't want the conclusions of mistaken reasoning. So if they just make mistakes in reasoning, then it's all right to interfere with them, or at least you don't have an objection you otherwise would have, because you're not really telling people they shouldn't prefer what they do prefer. You're just interfering with their mistaken reasoning process in getting to their beliefs. But here, what I want to question, of course from a libertarian point of view we would oppose that, but what I want to question is sort of an unexamined assumption that somehow what's important to people is just choice under certain optimal conditions, if not optimal, at least good conditions, conditions such that people are making reasoning correctly without fallacy. So we have, or sometimes people add, people are not unduly influenced in certain unacceptable ways. And it's ruled out without much examination that the view that people have rights not to be coerced regardless of how they arrive at their choices, if they choose by means that are bad ones, that's really up to them. It's not for the state or other people to interfere with them by force. Now, even if you don't think that's the correct view, I imagine most people in this room do think that's the correct view, but even if you don't think that's the correct view, what I just want to bring out here is that they're introducing into the analysis this unexamined assumption that people care, or that what we're concerned with in ethics is only protecting autonomous choice, or choice that fulfills certain conditions. If they think that, they need to come up with some argument for it. If I could just be allowed one digression that really doesn't have anything to do with fallacies in reasoning. Sometimes, say people, when you have a self-contradictory expression like libertarian paternalism, people call that an oxymoron, but I don't think that's really strictly correct. An oxymoron is sort of a figure of speech where there's an apparent contradiction, but it really does make sense to use it. So it's better not to substitute. Oxymoron isn't just a fancy way of saying self-contradiction. It's better to avoid that term unless you have a pretty more definite idea of what it means in rhetoric. But I say that was just a digression. Now, another example of an unexamined assumption in use of ethics in economics is one of the most pervasive. And this one is the assumption without argument that egalitarianism, sort of the view that people should have equal income or wealth or other good things, is ethically mandated or at least desirable. So people, there was a famous book by Arthur Oken, who was, I think, was one of the top advisors to the president, some of the presidents on the equity efficiency trade-off, where equity meant something like equality. So the argument was that justice requires us all to be equal, but if we had equality, this wouldn't be an efficient economy, since, say, why would you produce more than others if you knew you were going to be getting an equal share regardless of what the production was? So we have some sort of trade-off between equity and and efficiency. But there's no argument given that equality is something good. It's just taken as an assumption. You find this again in this economist Robert Frank that I mentioned earlier on the steroids. He said that the reason we don't have absolute equality is that this wouldn't be efficient. He's ruled out from the start the notion of Lockean property rights, or that people have individual rights to acquire property regardless of whether other people have equal amounts or not. Again, I think, as you'll not be surprised here, that's the correct theory, but even if you don't think so, certainly this theory needs to be examined. It can't just be ruled out of consideration. Sometimes many economists in the area that's called welfare economics, which is sort of the branch of economics that asks not just a descriptive question how the economy works, but tries to figure out how the economy should work, what policies should we institute. Implicitly assumes a type of utilitarianism. Remember, utilitarianism is the system of ethics that says that we should maximize happiness or maximize the balance of pleasure or pain. But there's a very big difficulty, as you know, with this view that, remember from your introductory lectures here, we can't measure interpersonal utility. So the welfare economists have a problem. They say, well, what are we going to do? We can't measure interpersonal utility, but we still want to adhere to some kind of utilitarianism. So they try to come up with certain ways of saying we can have a welfare increase in total utility without violating this constraint. That is to say, without violating the constraint that we can't measure interpersonal utility. So one probably the most famous way of trying to get around this is the so-called Pareto criterion. So now this criterion, there's sort of weak version and stronger, but I won't go into that. But the one version of the criterion is if there's some change that makes at least one person better off and no one worse off, then this passes this criterion. So the people who favor this as a welfare measure will say, well, we don't have to worry about measuring utility, because all we have to say is somebody's utility has gone up. So we don't have to measure that. We know that this is desirable because somebody's gone up and no one's worse off. So then there's been an increase in utility. Now, I don't want to, the various challenges one could make to the theory of the criterion, but what I want to emphasize here is just using this as sort of and other similar criteria that are developed from it as the whole basis of welfare economics, just rules out from the start, appeals to rights or other competing theories. So as I say, there's an implicit utilitarianism involved if this criterion is taken as the whole of welfare economics, where you're saying, well, we like to maximize welfare in the utilitarian sense, but we can't do it in the full-bodied way because we can't measure interpersonal utility, so we're stuck with this. So by reasoning in that way, they're ruling out without examination other competing ethical theories. I'll just mention one other extension of the Pareto approach. One problem, if you stick within the terms of this Pareto approach, is there are very few changes that are what they call Pareto superior. That's to say, ones that fulfill this criterion, ones that make at least one person better off and no one worse off. So there's a weaker criterion called the Kaldor-Hicks criterion. And in order to pass this, the winners from a change have to be able to compensate the losers. So there are measures that can pass the Kaldor-Hicks criterion that don't pass the Pareto one. There are problems with this also. So the winner don't have to actually compensate the losers, just they could compensate the losers. So see, the losers might not be very happy just being told they could be compensated. But I'm just mentioning this now not to go into the technical problems of this criterion, but it's just, I want to just reiterate that economists who use this have really ruled out without investigation other competing ethical theories, such as an appeal to rights, the libertarian kind, or I suppose even other non-libertarian rights theories. These are ruled out from the beginning. Now, I think the last type of case I'll give also will involve ruling out certain alternatives without examination. I was reminded of this kind of case in the seminar I gave with Roderick Long yesterday afternoon. I should emphasize not that Roderick committed these fallacies, but the discussion reminded me of the points I want to mention. In the argument that some objectivists, supporters of Ayn Rand, give for their ethical theory, they'll say that the necessary condition of value is that there's a living entity. They'll say, well, suppose you had a case, say someone breaks a stone in half. It wouldn't make sense to say it's good for the stone or bad for the stone that it's broken in half. Only say if it's a living entity, say it's a plant or an animal, would it make sense to say that destroying that entity is a bad thing? If we're dealing with something that isn't living, it doesn't make sense to talk about value. So, now, what's wrong with this, it may be that that's a correct it may be that that view is correct, but the problem for this is that it's assuming without argument that value, when you speak of value, you're speaking of value for something. There are other sorts of theories of value that would just claim certain states of affairs are just good or bad in themselves. It isn't a question of whether something is good for something. Something just good is absolutely. As I say, I don't mean to advocate such theories, but I mean someone, say, could hold if objects are arranged in a certain aesthetically pleasing fashion, that's something good or valuable. So, say if you disrupted the arrangement of the stone in a certain way, that would be bad according to this theory. Even though it wouldn't be bad for the stone, it would just be bad. So, I say you might not think much of that theory, but the point I just want to mention here, it is another sort of theory, so it's wrong just to say, well, this is the only basis of value, and then just act as if we don't have any alternative. Now you find, unfortunately, I remember this is a point that Robert Nozick made in an article called On the Randian Argument. He pointed out that sometimes objectivists will act as if they have the only theory of value. Value just doesn't make sense unless you accept the way their view of the matter. And he said, well, what's going on here? There are all sorts of competing value theories. They might have the best theory. He didn't think they did, but I mean, it's possible they do, but they can't just say this is the only theory when there are other theories out there. But they do that. There was a recent book by Tara Smith, who's a very good philosopher, who still uses this argument. She says, well, this is the only way you can conceive of value. Now, I want to close with sort of a related error that at least I think is an error, that you find actually comes up, an example that comes up in what I think an objectivist would respond to what I just said. He'd say, well, the theory of value I just mentioned is an example of intrinsicism. Intrinsicism, I'm not quite sure all the exact definition of what they mean by intrinsicism, but the theory I gave would be an example of this. It would be something like a theory that takes certain properties to hold under all conditions, not relative to context. So the theory I gave would say certain arrangements of objects are good just in themselves. It's not good for something, it's just good in itself. So I'll say, well, this is an intrinsicism. So the fallacy here is just to claim that a position you're opposed to is a fallacy without refuting it. Just say, well, this commits the intrinsic fallacy. What is supposed to be the argument that is a fallacy? People just say, this is intrinsicism, as if that were to condemn it just in itself. Another example of this, I've been critical of the Randians enough. They'll think too much, I'm sure. But another example is people will say certain ethical views, such as the ones held by Aristotelians or objectivists or Murray Rothbard, commit the is-ought fallacy or violate Hume's law, which he said you can't deduce an ought from an is. Well, he certainly said this, but I mean, just saying that sort of deduction is a fallacy isn't showing that it is. I'm not claiming that it isn't one, but I mean, we need to have, there are all sorts of arguments on both sides that one can't just say, point to a certain position, say this is commit such and such a fallacy as if that was it. Now, sometimes, and this will be, I think, the last point I'll mention since I'm almost out of time, is that sometimes I find this, especially in discussions of this is-ought problem, that people, when asked to give an argument for it, will simply reiterate the point in other words. I'll say, if you say, well, why can't you derive, I say, well, why can't you derive an ought from an is? Well, they'll say, well, then you'd be deriving a normative conclusion from descriptive premises. That's just another way of saying you can't derive an ought from an is. It isn't an argument for it. Now, sometimes all one can do in an argument is just say, here's the point, I don't have any further argument for it. Just, if you think about it, you'll just see that this is evident. This is just the way you just look at it. If you think about it, you'll see you can't do this. And then I think that's a legitimate move. Sometimes you just have to see things or you don't see them. But if you do that, you should be clear that that's what you're doing and not think you're coming up for an argument for something when you're not. Well, I see we're out of time, so we can now all rush and get our lunch boxes. Thank you.